Hello, and welcome to JAC Products Visual Inspection Training Lesson 1, Additional Practice. The purpose of this training is to provide a more detailed and in-depth look into the training, explain how to use the tools, and show you examples of the tools in use. In the attribute column, there are different criteria that must all be met for a defect to be acceptable. The first is max size. This is telling you how big the defect can be. For this example, the defect must be less than or equal to 2 millimeters in size. Anything bigger than 2 millimeters is a reject. Next is minimum distance. If there is more than one defect of this type in the zone, you must measure the distance between them. In this example, the defects must be at least 100 millimeters apart from each other. If they are closer than that, it is a reject. Finally is max quantity. This tells you how many defects of this type are allowed in the zone. This example shows that there are only 2 defects allowed. If there are more than 2, reject the part. Now let's look at an example and walk through the attribute criteria. Is the size of this defect 2 millimeters or smaller? Yes, both are shown to be at 2 millimeters. Is the distance between them 100 millimeters or more? Yes, the distance is shown to be 100 millimeters. Are there 2 defects or less? Yes, there are only 2 defects. Based on the answers to those questions, you would pass this part. Remember, you must answer yes to each question. If any of them was a no, you would have rejected this part. Let's look at another example. But wait a minute, why are there multiple numbers listed for max size? Don't worry, it's actually really easy to understand. You would read it like this. If any of the defects are less than or equal to 1.5 millimeters in size, the defects must be 50 millimeters apart from each other, and you are allowed a quantity of 3. But wait, there's more. As an added bonus, if all of the defects are less than or equal to 1 millimeter, they still have to be 50 millimeters apart from each other, but you can have a quantity of 5 defects. In this example, all 3 defects are less than or equal to 1.5 millimeters, and they are at least 50 millimeters apart from each other. This part would be passed based on the first set of criteria in orange. This shows 5 defects, and they are all less than or equal to 1 millimeter, and they are all 50 millimeters apart from each other. This part would be a pass based on the second set of criteria in yellow. But what about this part? One of the defects is 1.5 millimeters, and the other 2 are at 1 millimeter. Because there is one defect greater than 1 millimeter, but less than or equal to 1.5 millimeters, you will use the orange criteria and pass this part. Now we can put it all together and read the CAS. Let's pretend you have a TMMC 420A part and it is painted, and you want to determine if you should ship the part. It has a defect which you determine to be on the A surface. After reading the descriptions and looking at pictures of defects, you identify this defect as dirt. Now you follow the dirt line over to where it intercepts the Zone A line and voila! Here is the criteria you use to make your decision. Easy, right? Let's take a look at an example. The example shows the defect is on the A surface and the defect type is dirt. Looking at our appearance standard, we look up dirt on the A surface, and here is the criteria we must use. First, the max quantity allowed is 3 at 1.5 millimeters or 5 at 1 millimeter. Let's count how many defects there are on the part. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, there are not too many defects, so now let's look at the size. The criteria is no bigger than 1.5 millimeters because there are only 3 defects. If there were 4 or 5, we would have to use the 1 millimeter criteria. We will use the circles to determine if they are less than or equal to 1.5 millimeters. Okay, they are all less than 1.5 millimeters. Now we can look at the distance apart. The criteria says the defects must be at least 50 millimeters apart from each other, so we can use the ruler to measure. Uh-oh, they are less than 50 millimeters apart from each other. That means we must fail this part. Let's look at another example. This time, the defect is on the A surface, and it is a fingernail scratch. Going to our appearance standard, we look up scratches on the A surface and find our criteria. The quantity allowed is 3, so let's see how many scratches are on the part. There is only 1 scratch, so there is not too many. Because there is only 1 scratch, we do not need to worry about minimum distance apart. For this criteria, there are 2 different types of scratches listed: hairline and fingernail. We know this is a fingernail scratch, so we must use the 5 millimeter size. There are 2 ways we can use to measure this scratch. The first is the ruler. When we place the ruler on the scratch, it is more than 5 millimeters. There is another method we can use, which is the defined lines. We can line up the scratch with the 5 millimeter line and see that our scratch is more than 5 millimeters. Either tool will give us the answer that this scratch is too long and we must fail it. Here's another example. This one is on the B surface and it's a dent. We look at the appearance standard and find dent on the B surface, and here is the criteria. Okay, the standard allows 3 defects at 2 millimeters in size and 5 defects at 1.5 millimeters in size. This part only has 2 defects. We will use the 2 millimeter size circle since there are only 2 defects. Again, if there were 4 or 5 defects, we would have to use the 1.5 millimeter size circle. So far so good, the quantity and size are acceptable. Now let's measure the distance apart from each other. Using the ruler, we will place the 0 mark on the edge of one of the defects and read the number touching the other defect. Oh no! The requirement is 20 millimeters apart from each other, but these are less than that. This is another failed part. Let's look at one last example. This is an A surface hairline scratch. Once again, we look up scratch on the A surface on our appearance standard. This time, the scratch is identified as hairline, so we will use the 50 millimeter max size criteria. Using the ruler, we measure the length of the scratch, and it is less than 50 millimeters, so the size is acceptable. Next, we look at quantity. The standard allows 3 scratches, and we only have 1. Because there is only 1 scratch, we do not need to worry about the distance apart from each other. So the part meets size, distance apart, and quantity, so we would pass this part. When using the appearance standard, don't forget to use these tips. If there is more than 1 defect on the part, make sure to check the distance apart from each other. If the appearance standard says none allowed, that means you cannot have any of those defects on the part at all. If the appearance standard says no limit, that means you can have any size, quantity, or amount of defects of that type on the part. And now it's time to take a test using everything you just learned. Using your particle template and the corporate appearance standard for Test B, determine whether you would pass or fail each of the parts listed on your test paper. There are a total of 20 questions. Fill in the circle corresponding to the answer that you think is correct.